The hallway buzzed with the steady rhythm of a joint bass morning. Boots striking polished tile, radios crackling with clipped voices, and officers exchanging curt greetings like rehearsed lines in a play they had performed 1,000 times. Lights slanted in from narrow windows above, cutting across the neutral-toned walls, catching the brass nameplates on doors that led to rooms filled with classified operations and secrets few outside the chain of command ever glimpsed. Amid the motion, a single figure moved deliberately, almost like a shadow slipped between the footfalls of the morning rush. She was in civilian clothes, unassuming, a light gray blouse, dark slacks, and simple flats that made no sound against the tile. A small black notebook rested lightly at her side, fingers brushing the edges without gripping it. Her hair was pulled into a plain twist at the nape of her neck. Nothing in her attire invited attention, except, perhaps, the calm that seemed to radiate from her as she walked, as if the world's chaos existed on a plane separate from her. Colonel Marcus Reddington spotted her immediately. A sharp laugh burst from him, loud enough to ripple across the hall. "Our new consultant," he announced, voice dripping with mock respect. "Let's see if she lasts even 1 hour on an active base." A few soldiers chuckled, eager to curry favor with the colonel, while others stiffened, pretending to study paperwork that had already lost its meaning. Grace Callahan did not flinch. She simply nodded once, her expression neutral and unreadable, a still point in the swirling motion around her. That single act of composure drew more attention than any reaction could have. Petty Officer Jonah Reeves, leaning against a doorway further down the hall, observed her with narrowed eyes. Her posture, her unhurried movement, the way she seemed to fit in without trying, it all suggested someone far more accustomed to environments where missteps could cost far more than embarrassment. Grace made no sudden movements, no unnecessary gestures. She blended into the background, but every line of her body suggested awareness, precision, and control. Captain Eric Lawson fell into step alongside her, badge clipped neatly to his uniform. At first glance, he filed her away as yet another civilian inspector from Washington, someone who would skim forms, nod politely, and vanish. But even in the first few steps, he noticed the anomalies. She did not wander. She did not hesitate. Every step was measured, balanced, like someone who had spent years moving through spaces where the wrong angle or misjudged stride could be fatal. Her head stayed level, shoulders relaxed but squared, eyes scanning without staring, reading the room without announcing her presence. When a squad of soldiers passed by, rifles swinging in rhythm with their march, she shifted her weight only slightly, subtle enough that an inattentive observer would miss it. Yet her feet remained planted at angles that suggested she was aware of the environment down to the smallest detail: trip hazards, lines of sight, distances between individuals. Lawson glanced at her from the corner of his eye, realizing that most civilians would flinch at the sudden bark of a sergeant or the slam of a heavy door. She did neither. Her breathing stayed calm, steady, a slow metronome that hinted at endurance beyond mere observation. "Ma'am," Lawson said politely, gesturing toward a doorway. "The colonel is waiting in the conference room. He likes to start briefings on the dot." Grace inclined her head in acknowledgement. "Then we should not keep him waiting, Captain," she replied, voice even low. No apology, no hurry, just a quiet acceptance of timing as a fact, not a threat. Inside the conference room, officers clustered around a large digital map, murmuring over schedules, fuel allocations, and training exercises. The conversation dwindled to a hush as Lawson and Grace entered. Major Laura Bennett, operations officer, flicked her gaze at Grace, taking in the unremarkable clothes, the small notebook, and the calm posture, filing her mentally under temporary inconvenience. Reddington did not hide his reaction. He leaned over the table, fingers pressing a highlighted route. When Lawson cleared his throat, he straightened, turning slowly to take in Grace from shoes to eyes. Rank patches were absent. Authority on the surface was invisible. "So this is our consultant," Reddington drawled, stretching the word like a private joke. "Welcome to the real world, ma'am." Grace met his gaze evenly. "Thank you for taking the time, Colonel," she said, voice calm, eyes neutral, unmoving. She did not fill the silence. She did not seek approval. Around the table, lieutenants exchanged glances. Civilians came and went all the time. Nods, checklists, polite smiles. This one seemed different. "Have a seat right there, ma'am," Reddington said, gesturing to the far end. "We'll try to keep the big words slow and simple." A ripple of polite, nervous laughter followed. Grace seated herself, notebook flat, hands resting lightly on the table, fingers relaxed. Lawson took position against the wall, close enough to answer questions, far enough to observe. The briefing began. Slides flashed across the screen: training completion rates, equipment readiness, personnel status. Reddington spoke with rehearsed confidence, barely glancing at notes. "You will not find much to complain about here," he said, voice measured, practiced. Grace listened. Eyes moved between the screen and the faces in the room. When he paused, she leaned forward slightly. "The readiness rate on your tactical vehicles," she asked, "precise, controlled. Does that percentage include those currently listed as awaiting major parts, or are those removed from the count?" A fraction of a second's pause fell over the room. That was not a surface-level inquiry. Bennett blinked, glanced at Reddington. "We adjust for long-term maintenance," he replied smoothly. "You do not need to worry about the fine print. The system accounts for it automatically." Grace made a small notation in her book. "Respectfully, I would like to see the list of vehicles awaiting major components later." Her tone was calm, professional, an intention, not a challenge. As the briefing progressed, she asked about training schedules, casualty evacuation drills, and night duty rotation. Her questions pierced beyond surface numbers into structure, procedure, and operational reality. How many soldiers were pulled from long-term training for urgent cosmetic tasks? How often was communications equipment tested under stress versus just powered on? Reddington's smile grew tighter. "Good to see that enthusiasm, ma'am," he said, voice brushing condescension. Later, outside the conference room, Grace and Lawson walked along barracks, observing formations and minor discrepancies unnoticed by most. She noted peeling paint, a corporal flinching at raised voices, minor oversights that alone seemed trivial, but together suggested cracks in the chain of command. Her hand brushed the narrow metal bracelet on her wrist, a subtle anchor engraved with wings and an anchor, faint from years of wear, grounding her silently, privately. Petty Officer Reeves across the way did not miss the small gesture. Neither did the subtle awareness in her posture, her gaze, her timing. By the second morning, Reddington had turned the daily briefing into a showcase, pacing, demonstrating, narrating every chart and slide with flair. Grace remained calm, notebook closed, observing the rhythm and patterns, not the theatrics. A perimeter slide flashed across the screen. "This is what we call a perimeter," he said. "The outside edge. Bad guys stay out. We're flawless." "I am familiar with the concept of a perimeter, Colonel," she said softly, without challenge, yet her tone carried weight. Reddington's forced smiles and explanations continued. Each time an officer tried to offer reality, he polished it into perfection, hiding flaws, controlling narrative. Grace watched, quiet, assessing, not impressed, not threatened, only aware. Later still, in a communications room smelling of dust and electronics, she spoke with Staff Sergeant Caleb Brooks. Broken radios, delayed relays, improvisation under strain. The truth behind the polished reports spilled out. Grace listened without surprise, without judgment. She understood what her eyes, ears, and mind had already recorded. People adapting, systems failing, leaders performing theater while reality bled underneath. She thanked Brooks and walked away. Lawson noted her calm certainty, her ability to process complex failure without panic. By midday, even Reddington began to feel a subtle unease. Grace asked questions, observed carefully, noted inconsistencies. Her presence shifted the room's dynamic. Soldiers watched, officers hesitated, minor cracks began to show. A live-fire exercise drew Grace's attention next. From a small rise, she tracked timing, movements, hesitations, micro-adjustments. Every misstep, every hesitation, every overreaction, every underreaction. She cataloged it silently, her mind piecing patterns together. Even Reddington's attempts to dominate the exercise, to assert control through public reprimand, could not unsettle her. She measured, she watched, she calculated, not a civilian spectator, but someone intimately familiar with consequence, discipline, and danger. Petty Officer Reeves followed her movements with quiet approval. Every step, every glance, every measured breath revealed experience far beyond what the colonel had imagined. By late afternoon, the subtle threads of disruption she wove, the quiet corrections, the silent scrutiny, had begun to unsettle the command. The colonel's performance of authority now met a presence that neither flinched nor yielded, quietly exposing the cracks in his armor. Late afternoon sunlight had drained to a dim gold, painting the joint base in long, sharp shadows. Grace Callahan moved through the compound with the same quiet precision she had displayed since arrival. Her notebook stayed closed, resting lightly against her side, as if she carried the calculations and observations entirely in her mind. The first alarm came from the comms tower, a low, intermittent beep. Minor at first, almost insignificant, but Grace noticed immediately. She paused, tilted her head, listening. Other officers glanced at each other nervously, assuming the system glitch was minor, routine. By the time Reddington strode into the communications room, the beep had evolved into a full-blown warning. Lights blinked erratically across panels. Screens froze mid-feed, interrupted by static and bursts of unreadable data. The colonel barked orders, but his voice sounded oddly hollow in the room, swallowed by the rising hum of alarmed electronics. Grace stepped forward. "Control logs, frequency checks, manual override," she said calmly, almost casually, scanning the panels like a chessboard. "No hesitation, no theatrics, just observation, calculation, execution." Reddington stiffened. "Ma'am, this is a complex system. You might want to." "Colonel," she interrupted smoothly, voice flat but firm, "I've dealt with similar failures under live conditions. We do not have the luxury of delay." The officers froze, some mouths open mid-protest, unsure whether to obey or step back. Grace's presence carried a quiet authority that overrode rank, polished commands, and decades of ceremony. Within minutes, she had traced the signal anomaly, identified the cascade of cascading software failures, and coordinated manual resets. Her hands moved across keyboards and control panels in a rhythm that made the chaos feel like a choreography, each tap precise, measured, deliberate. Brooks, the staff sergeant, leaned over a terminal, trying to follow her logic. "I didn't know we could reroute frequencies like that," he admitted quietly. Grace didn't look up. "You can. You just need to understand which parameters matter under stress." By the time the first static cleared, the entire command room had gone silent. Officers, soldiers, and staff stared at her. Even Reddington, whose ego had been a constant shield, felt the faint unease of watching someone operate entirely out of the expected chain of authority and succeed. "Status?" Reddington finally asked, voice tight, betraying irritation he could not hide. "All lines restored," Grace replied. Her tone suggested neither triumph nor relief, only observation. "Systems are stable, but temporary. The underlying vulnerability still exists. A repeat could compromise operations within 24 hours. A murmur rippled through the room. That was not merely a fix, it was a warning. Later, in a small corridor near the operations center, Grace and Lawson walked side by side. He exhaled slowly, glancing at her. "You handled that differently. Faster than anyone I've ever seen, including Reddington." She didn't reply immediately. Instead, she tilted her head toward the comms tower, where flickering panels cast long, distorted shadows. "Authority isn't granted by rank," she said finally. "It's proven in moments where failure is not an option." Lawson nodded slowly. He understood the weight of what she had just done. Others might take credit, but she had assessed, acted, and completed the task with precision under pressure. No theatrics, no ego, just results. The next day, subtle changes began to ripple through the base. Officers paused when she walked by, glances flicking nervously toward her presence. Soldiers whispered in corners, noting her calm demeanor, her quiet mastery over the environment. Reddington attempted his usual theatrics in briefings and exercises, but Grace's observations, often silent, had begun to make his authority appear performative rather than absolute. By evening, she was invited to a private debrief with Reddington, ostensibly to discuss procedural recommendations. The colonel leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, trying to reclaim control of the conversation. "Your methods are unorthodox," he said, carefully measured, "but effective. I'd like to know more about your approach before we make suggestions to higher command." Grace met his gaze evenly. "Unorthodox only when standard procedures fail to anticipate reality. That is why observation, analysis, and decisive action are necessary at every level." He frowned, leaning forward. "You don't just notice details, you exploit them. You understand failures before they happen. Most of my officers, they can't see past the report sheets." A subtle smile touched her lips, almost imperceptible. Most people are trained to follow instructions, she said quietly. Following is simple, seeing is hard.